Order, order. Mark Pawsey to move the motion, please.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma, and may I say at the outset what a pleasure it is to serve under your chairmanship. It's a very great privilege to have been able to secure an important debate on genetic haemochromatosis, and that's an issue where I'm chair of the all-party parliamentary group, and I'm seeking in our debate today to raise awareness of the condition both within Westminster and more widely. And in my remarks, Mr. Sharma, I'll explain what genetic haemochromatosis is and its prevalence within the UK. I'll also look at how this condition fits into the NHS priorities. And at the end of my remarks, I'll present three asks to the Minister, both on behalf of the charity Haemochromatosis UK, who I know are represented here today, and the all-party parliamentary group. Mr. Sharma, until quite recently, this was a condition that I knew nothing about. And 2-3 years ago, I visited the charity Haemochromatosis UK, who are based in my constituency of Rugby. And it was explained to me about the condition. And one of the key issues that was drawn to my attention was sort of lack of awareness of the condition and the importance of early diagnosis. And as a consequence of discussions with the charity and with other members, some of whom are here today, we formed an all-party group earlier this year. And this was based on the report that Haemochromatosis UK published in October 2018, and that highlighted the previously underestimated impact of this condition in terms of the number of people who are affected and the chronic effect it has on people's lives. Our APPG first meeting was in January of this year, and we met again in May to talk about the adoption of clinical guidelines, which I'll refer to later on. So, first of all, what is genetic haemochromatosis? Now, this is a genetic condition in which the body fails to control the absorption of iron. Members may have heard of it described to as iron overload or iron overload disorder. And what happens is that iron builds up within the body and reaches a level at which it becomes highly toxic, and that can lead to a multitude of different health problems. Iron builds up particularly in the body's liver, and the damage is progressive, and at its worst, iron overload can kill through liver failure and heart failure. Now, I'll happily give way. That's useful.
I stand as an ignoramus on this matter, but here because my good friend is leading the debate, and I want to support him, and I want to know more about it. But thank you very much, Mr. Sharma, for letting me intervene. Could I ask my good friend whether this is something that's in a baby from birth, and if not, when is the normal age at which it develops?
Well, this is, Mr. Sharma, this is a genetic condition which becomes apparent in some people who possess the gene, and there is a variable degree to which people are affected. And I'll come on to talk about some of the debilitating consequences of genetic haemochromatosis, which include arthritis, it includes joint pain, diabetes, fatigue, psychological or cognitive difficulties, some skin conditions, menstrual problems in women, impotence, breathing and heart problems, abdominal pain, liver problems, which I've referred to, and also hair loss. Now, because this condition isn't widely spoken about in both medical and public life, it doesn't mean that it's not prevalent in the UK. It is. And our UK white population of North European and particularly people of Celtic extraction gives the UK the highest prevalence anywhere in the world. And it's found around the world wherever the Irish and Celtic population has migrated to. And of course that includes in Australia, in the Americas and in South Africa. Now, 1 in 8 people in the UK carry a faulty copy of the GH gene. And that faulty gene is known as HFE, and 1 in 200 people carry two faulty copies of this HFE gene, and those are the people who are at risk of iron toxicity. And in layman terms, Mr. Sharma, people must carry 2 copies of the gene for them to be affected by the condition. And it's estimated that there are around 380,000 people around the world with this genetic hemochromatosis mutation. I'll make my point if I may. Referring to the numbers, of those 380,000 people, 200,000 are under 40 years old. And this is where the issue of early diagnosis becomes important, because if we can diagnose this condition early, people then won't get overlooked and they will be able to attend to those symptoms. I'll happily give way to my honourable friend.
I thank the honourable gentleman very much for giving way, and thank you, Mr Sharma. I wanted to congratulate my honourable friend for securing this important debate, and also for outlining for all of us who don't have as much knowledge how prevalent this disease actually is, and how important it is that we get services and treatment right. And may I put on record my thanks to my constituent Roger Keat, who is a trustee of Haemochromatosis UK and has done a good job in educating myself. And I thank him and others who are working very hard to help a lot of people who are affected.
My honourable friend is exactly right. This charity who has served to raise awareness have done a fantastic job, and my honourable friend's constituent is very proud. But I should just point out this is a condition rather than a disease. A disease may be considered to be something that could be contagious. So I've mentioned that the prevalence is highest in Ireland, and in fact in Northern Ireland I think where 1 in 5 people are carriers, which is information derived from the Irish Haemochromatosis Association. And the influence of people from Celtic origin leads to some people referring to genetic hemochromatosis as the Celtic curse, and it's a term that's not looked on favourably, but it does underline the prevalence and the need for Irish and indeed Scottish and Welsh people and their doctors in particular to be aware of the condition. And I'm delighted to see in the chamber today representatives of both Wales and Scotland here, some of whom I know are going to contribute to the debate.
Some of us are half Scottish.
Now, I've already mentioned, Mr Sharma, that the condition is poorly diagnosed, and recent research tells us there are at least 45,000 people affected in the UK who are loading iron as their bodies fail to control the absorption, and only 10 to 13% of these are diagnosed. So for every patient that's diagnosed, there are between 8 and 10 patients who have the symptoms, but they're not recognised, and they are the people who are often suffering, unaware of what's happening to them. And Professor Ted Fitzsimmons of the University of Glasgow, who has done a great deal of work in this area, highlights that 80 to 90% of individuals who have this condition are unaware that they have it. They don't know what it is, they know what the symptoms are that affect them, but they don't have an explanation for it. And Professor David Metzler from Exeter University, alongside the Haemochromatosis Research Group, have conducted a UK biobank study of 500,000 patients, and that was published in January 2019. And that found that people with the double hemochromatosis mutation, that they had 4 times the risk of liver disease, twice the risk of arthritis and frailty in older age groups, with 50% more risk of pneumonia and diabetes compared to those who don't suffer from the condition. And this study also reported that the current generation with the condition of 136,000 people aged 40 plus, of those 136,000, approximately 12,200 will have had a hip replacement that they wouldn't have needed if they'd been earlier diagnosed and treated for this iron overload. The study, however, does have a caveat that there is uncertainty about whether all would have been avoided by early diagnosis. But as with any condition, Mr Sharma, we know that early diagnosis is crucial. I'll happily give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. And my constituents, Jane and Andrew, who both have haemochromatosis and have contacted me about this debate, have both stressed to me the importance of early diagnosis. And would you agree with me that it can be difficult sometimes to be very clear about the symptoms and therefore difficult to get a diagnosis, and that this is something we must work on?
the Honourable Lady is exactly right. Very often people suffer from the symptoms and persevere. They're feeling tired, just generally unwell, but they don't know why they're affected. And so awareness of the condition amongst the medical profession when people present with the symptoms is vital in identifying those that are affected.
When he wants.
Sure. With regard to the additional demands on the NHS, we can estimate that people with the condition there would give an extra 564 patients diagnosed with liver disease and 125 new liver cancer patients every single year. So if we can diagnose this, enable clinicians to be aware of it and deal with it earlier, we can prevent a very substantial demand on the NHS. I'll happily give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma, for allowing me to intervene on my good friend, and may I congratulate my good friend on getting this debate. As I'm half Scottish, I've had my hip replaced, and I feel tired most of the time. I'm worried, but not so worried as actually doctors must be, because it seems to me that if you go with normal symptoms like that, it must be bloody difficult for general practitioners to diagnose this condition on normal people. And everyone's nodding, so I presume that's right.
Well, Mr. Sharma, the honourable gentleman... The Honourable Gentleman makes a very valuable point, and so this may be a question for the Honourable Gentleman when he next visits his GP, armed with the knowledge that he now has as a consequence of this debate, to suggest to the GP that might be an issue to consider. And in terms of the cost saving to the NHS, Mr. Chandler, if we can deal with this, we know that basic tests for iron levels in blood would cost only £1 per patient, if routinely done at the same time as other blood tests. This isn't commonly done, and perhaps it should be. Iron testing could be added to the NHS health check, which people receive at the age of 50, and that in itself may provide a pointer to some of the symptoms that my honourable friend has just referred to. The UK Biobank study also indicates that the HFE gene is associated with significant morbidity, particularly arthritis and liver disease. And of course, because of the influence of the liver, there is increased risk of highly increased risk of liver cancer compared to the general population. And we know that there are approximately 6,000 national cases of liver cancer per annum, and the outlook for liver cancer, Mr. Sharma, is particularly poor. Survival from liver cancer is amongst the lowest of all cancers. Now, again, Professor Ted Fitzsimmons at Glasgow estimates that the cost of a liver transplant at around £100,000, with a broad brush estimate, and that excludes personal costs such as the loss of employment and the need for family members. So again, we know that early diagnosis could not only improve the lives of those affected, but also act as a significant saving to the NHS. Since my involvement with genetic hemochromatosis, one of the issues that's had an impact on me has been the stories of patients affected by the condition. And if I may, Chair, I'd just like to refer to a couple of patient testimonies. And one of them is also a trustee of Haemochromatosis UK, and that's Michelle Wira-Seka. And this is Michelle's account. She says, I was diagnosed with genetic hemochromatosis after suffering from chronic fatigue for some time. I'd visited my GP and had been told to take folic acid, and wouldn't have returned had I not had a routine blood test carried out for an insurance policy that I was taking out. So she became aware of her condition accidentally. I returned to my GP, who, thinking that I may be anemic, ran a ferritin test. This showed that my results were elevated, and I was referred to a haematologist. I had a ferri scan carried out, which showed some stored iron in my liver. But luckily, with regular vivisection, and that's taking of blood, over the last 18 months, I've managed to reduce my ferritin levels, and I'm now in what's called the maintenance phase. I hope soon to become a blood donor, and that's an issue I want to raise with the Minister later on, so that my blood can be put to good use. I know how lucky I have been by being diagnosed when I was. Having talked to my GP since diagnosis, I know that haemochromatosis was not on his radar, and this is why raising awareness is so important. Had I not returned to the GP, my body would have carried on storing iron, and the outcome for my future health would have not looked so positive. A second testimony is from a haemochromatosis patient, and this is a young woman who's only 27, called Catherine Hoff, and who has had a real fight to be taken seriously by the medical profession, largely because when genetic haemochromatosis makes itself known, it generally happens with older people. So the key point about Catherine's concerns is that she's relatively young, and she says, despite the advantage of being diagnosed young, I've often had to fight to be taken seriously by the medical profession. Doctors seem to think that it won't affect me as I am young, and they are accustomed to solving health issues rather than helping maintain good health and prevent problems. I have had many cases where specialists think that as I'm a young woman and my symptoms are not as severe as those suffered by older people, that I'm healthy and should have nothing to worry about. But I'm only 27. If they stop and think for a moment to consider it, I should not have joint pains. My knees shouldn't hurt when I walk. I want to prevent further damage and not wait until my symptoms are very bad. This is my health, and I have to fight for it. And I think both of those stories, Mr. Sharma, highlight how important is the need for early diagnosis and an increased awareness of the condition amongst GPs and other medical professionals. The frustrating thing is that treatment will alleviate many of the symptoms in a large number of cases, and the earliest intervention prevents many of those problems that I've described, including build-up of iron in the liver and the heart. Now, the treatment, in the very vast majority of cases, is vivisection, and that's essentially giving blood. Done intensively, this removes the excess iron from the body effectively, and done routinely on a regular basis, it will maintain iron levels. In simple terms, the body uses some of the excess stored iron to make red blood cells to replace those that are taken. And this is a very safe and proven procedure. It's very similar, Mr. Sharma, to giving blood when those of us that go to donate blood. And in fact, the blood from a haemochromatosis patient is perfectly usable and would go some way to addressing NHS blood demand. However, blood taken in a vivisection clinic is discarded, it's thrown away, and that doesn't seem to make sense, and I'll come back to that in my final remarks as an ask to the Minister. So the question is, Mr. Sharma, why isn't this condition higher on the UK health agenda? And there are many and varied reasons for that, but one of them is a key of consistent clinical guidelines. Where there are protocols, they are often non-mandatory, they relate to an individual trust, they're inconsistent and often poorly adopted. The University of Exeter has done some research into the impact of iron overload and shows very wide inconsistencies in the experience of patients and the prevalence of chronic symptoms arising from non-diagnosis being much higher in the UK than was previously understood. So what we're looking for is for the Minister to respond to the point about introducing guidelines. If we have guidelines, that has the potential to increase diagnosis perhaps as much as tenfold, and this will prevent many people having the follow-on conditions of cancers, heart failures, diabetes that I've already referred to. A consultant rheumatologist at St George's Hospital in London, Dr. Keeley, tells us that a typically large joint replacement is in the order of £10,000. That may be of interest to my honourable friends. He also points out that his view that the big impact on healthcare costs is in primary care, with the delays in diagnosis. So those who suffer from less productivity when they're at work, often having to take time off work, but often wanting to continue at work, and presenteeism, where people turn up for work but are ineffective because of the debilitating conditions that they suffer from. And all of those are cost to society and burdens and things that the patients have to deal with. An article or an editorial for The Lancet on gastroenterology and hepatology in January 29 said, and I quote, "We wholeheartedly support the need to increase education and awareness of genetic hemochromatosis among clinicians to improve early diagnosis. The necessary tools are at hand, the guidelines are clear, and very significantly, Mr. Sharma, implementation would be cost-free." It's difficult to imagine, and this is a further part of the quotation, it's difficult to imagine a clinical problem that represents lower hanging fruit for the NHS. As such, there is no time at the present to elevate the priority of genetic hemochromatosis on the UK healthcare agenda. At our last meeting, I referred to Professor Ted Fitzsimmons at the University of Glasgow. He has produced a set of guidelines for the condition, which have been endorsed by a number of professional medical bodies. And the all-party group would like to see those guidelines adopted and expanded upon by NICE in order to improve and increase diagnosis and to improve and to standardise, importantly standardise, care after diagnosis. We believe that these would lead to getting genetic hemochromatosis higher on the NHS agenda. And the condition fits into two of those priorities and the NHS long-term plan, because the NHS long-term plan talks about prevention. Prevention of genetic hemochromatosis affecting patients is through effective diagnosis before the damage is done. If we can identify it, we can save the NHS money, but ensure the patient's health is protected early. And the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care drew attention to this in November of last year when he said, if we get prevention right, it holds the key to longer, healthier, happier lives and a sustainable, high-quality health and care system. It's why I made it one of my three big priorities. There is no easier win than adopting that for this particular condition. And another NHS priority seeks to support people to age well. And the Exeter University report highlighted the impact of genetic hemochromatosis on our ageing population. We know that this affects arthritis and frailty in older age groups, increases the risks of diabetes and chronic pain. This is an issue that we do need to address. And the three asks for the Minister, which I do hope she will respond to in her remarks, are, first of all, what steps can the Minister take to ensure that those people who are affected are promptly and correctly identified, regardless of where they live? We've already heard that early diagnosis saves lives, but yet so frequently people with genetic hemochromatosis suffer needlessly as a consequence of late diagnosis. And as a second ask of the Minister, what steps will she be able to take to encourage the NHS to adopt, to share and embed the best practice we've referred to, both through screening and through associated therapies, ensuring that vivisection is available? We know from Haemochromatosis' 1,800 members that NHS standards across the country vary widely. With a single system, we'd be able to offer a consistent world-class approach. And that brings me on to my third point, which is how can the Minister encourage different areas of the NHS system to collaborate more effectively to realise the economic benefits of joined-up care, but also the benefits to the patients of that. One example would be to make use of the blood that's taken at vivisection to incentivise NHS blood and transplants to make greater use of genetic hemochromatosis patient blood to meet ongoing needs. It's astounding that this blood that's collected is wasted, and that distresses many of the people who are affected by genetic hemochromatosis, who take the view that if they're going to have their blood taken, they would love to see it used productively to support other patients. Mr Chairman, I know there are other members who wish to contribute, and I very much look forward to the Minister's response to our asks at the conclusion of the debate. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered genetic hemochromatosis. Liz McKenzie.
Thank
Thank you, Mr Sharma, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for Rugby and the Chair of the APPG for bringing this debate. It's an important subject. I asked for a debate on it earlier this year, following the release of the research from the University of Exeter, showing that this condition was 20 times more common than was previously thought. So I'm pleased that the Honourable gentleman has secured this debate. And I'm also grateful to the charity Haemochromatosis UK, based in his constituency, whose website does contain a wealth of useful information. So the Honourable Gentleman has already given a very comprehensive opening speech, which showing his understanding and knowledge of the condition, so I don't need to repeat that. Instead, I want to talk about the research that was published this year and its implications. So, as we've heard, haemochromatosis is thought to be the UK's most common genetic disorder, and it's inherited in a recessive manner, linked to a faulty gene passed from both parents to their child. And it was previously believed to seriously affect about 1 in 100 carriers, but the new research has suggested that the true level could be closer to 1 in 10 amongst women and 1 in 5 for men. Researchers at the University of Exeter analysed data from 2,890 people from the UK Biobank who had mutations, who had the specific mutation that the Honourable Gentleman referred to. And the research was conducted on subjects aged between 40 and 70. So the point he made about the research maybe being limited in terms of the age range is a good one. But in the light of these findings, the UK National Screening Committee has said that it will be looking at the evidence to screen for haemochromatosis in 2019-20 as part of its routine 3-yearly review. And I'd be interested to hear the Minister's comments on that when she makes her closing remarks. So the lead researcher, Professor David Meltzer of the University of Exeter, has said that haemochromatosis is easy to treat if diagnosed early enough, and I think that's the key point of this debate. But the point also made by the Honourable Gentleman that it can be difficult to spot is also very pertinent. A lot of these symptoms can be very non-specific, and it isn't a condition that is uppermost in GPs' minds. And I think that's why we are now giving consideration to the idea of routine screening. So, as we've heard, the treatment is relatively simple and involves regular venesection or bloodletting. As the body makes more blood to replace that taken, it uses up the excess stored iron. And this treatment, if started early enough, can avoid the complications of haemochromatosis, as we've already referred to: liver failure, diabetes, chronic pain, severe arthritis. Early treatment can prevent these conditions developing later in life. And I want to illustrate the effect of having a diagnosis of haemochromatosis later in life by telling the story of my constituent, Paul Dickon. And Paul has given me permission to use him as a case history, and I think his story will strike a chord with many haemochromatosis sufferers. And Paul was diagnosed only this year, after years of suffering from symptoms including liver, joint and stomach problems, for which he has been taking multiple painkillers over the years. Since his diagnosis, he has been having venesection, but he tells me that he is now suffering from lethargy due to the frequency of venesection, no energy, muscle loss and joint pain. His depression is, he says, hitting a new low. And he says of his eventual diagnosis, and I quote, "I was being asked for a long time if I had a drink problem because of my liver problems, but I don't drink. And the haemochromatosis was only discovered because the doctor was worried about my white blood cells being too high." And Paul's case is a clear example of how raising awareness of this disease amongst GPs and medical professionals might have helped him to get an earlier diagnosis and spared him some of the painful symptoms and possibly inappropriate treatment. And I'm grateful to Paul for allowing me to tell his story. Testing for iron overload is simple, and GPs should be aware of the transferrin saturation test, where a result of greater than 50% indicates a risk of iron accumulation, and the patient should be referred to secondary care for further tests if that result of greater than 50% is found. And here, certainly I will.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma. From what I've heard today, which is the entire encyclopedia of my knowledge, it seems to me that if every blood test included a check, we would actually cover this pretty well, because most people have blood tests at some stage and fairly often these days.
I thank the Honourable Member for that point. I would just issue a caveat with blanket screening that it does have to be proven to be clinically effective, that we're not throwing up false positives and false negatives. But I think the tests are fairly specific for haemochromatosis. But obviously they will have to go through an evaluation process, as I'm sure the Minister will inform us when she makes her closing remarks. But just at this stage, I just want to mention the biomedical scientists and clinical scientists working in our NHS pathology labs. The often unsung heroes of the NHS. They're the people who will be performing these tests. And indeed, that was my profession before I was elected as the MP for Hayward and Middleton. Just in my closing remarks, I just want to say it's also important to discuss with any patient diagnosed with genetic haemochromatosis the desirability of genetic testing for other members of the family, as there is at least a 1 in 4 chance that a sibling will also have haemochromatosis. And family checks can frequently lead to detection of haemochromatosis before the organ damage has occurred. So that is really important. Now, it's really important that we are having this debate. Early diagnosis will help save lives, will help cut costs for the NHS, and will reduce unnecessary suffering for so many individuals like my constituent Paul and families around the UK. Thank you.
Martin Doherty Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma. It's good to see you in the chairs, sir. And can I first of all congratulate the member for Rugby and all the work that he does through the all-party parliamentary group and getting this debate today. And it's a delight to follow the member for Hayward and Middleton and hear about the experiences of their constituent. It's also said that the Celtic peoples have a tendency for fair skin, freckles, and being ginger. I can say, Mr. Sharma, I do have on the odd occasion fair skin. I do have freckles underneath here. And I am ginger. You might not believe it without a head of hair on me. And having a name which in the ancient is Marcin Sean O'Doherty O'Haid, and for Hansard I will send you the spelling in the ancient, it should come as no doubt that something commonly known, as the Honourable Member for Rugby pointed out, as the Celtic curse looms large in my constituency. It has one of the highest proportions of the Irish diaspora anywhere in these islands. And also its Celtic connection, Dunbreton, the capital of the Britons. I believe they moved to Wales around about the year 600. So we have a huge idea of what it means in terms of haemochromatosis. But again, let me be very clear that just because you're a Scot does not mean that you're a Celt. So we need to be very clear on that. But the ethnic link between, for example, Western Ireland, I'm sometimes known not only as a member for Western Bartonshire, but the member for Donegal. It gives you an idea of the genetic link in terms of the condition itself. And I want to also, first of all, highlight my constituent, David McAleer, who is a well-known member of my community through the Clydebank FC. And David's given me his permission to talk about him today, he also wants to pay his respects to Dr. Fitzsimmons and his team for everything they do at the University of Glasgow. David got the condition diagnosed because his mum got diagnosed, so it's not just about men. When getting diagnosed, his mother, they also found out that his younger brother got a diagnosis, that his father, on the other side of the family, is a carrier, as is his 2 other brothers. Indeed, my own late father-in-law was actually heard he had the condition later in his life before he passed away. And my brother-in-law then also went on to get tested, and he also has haemochromatosis. hemochromatosis and lives a very lively life indeed. I think it's also important to actually state, Mr. Sharma, in terms of the condition, that we need to have some very clear facts. My constituency, on the basis of population, given the statistics, there's about, and I'm grateful to the Haemochromatosis Association for the UK in these numbers, 350 people would have haemochromatosis. But given the genetic makeup of my community, it's not that diverse in terms of its Celtic makeup. I would assume it to be far higher. And also in relation to some of the costs of liver transplants, which vary across the UK, early diagnosis is the key in how we can treat the condition, and also its long-term impact in other areas of health care provision, whether it be through liver transplant, be it be through hip problems, bone issues, and a whole range of other issues as well. And I suppose there is, for me, a call to arms on, and it might not go down too well with some people, but possibility of offering automatic testing from birth about how we identify haemochromatosis in young people as quickly as possible, and to deal with the reality of haemochromatosis and its broader impact on society across the whole of the UK. And it is also notable that some of the other major issues around alcohol consumption, how in Scotland we have for many years been confounded by high levels of alcohol consumption, which are now reducing. Congratulate the Scottish Government in terms of pushing forward with minimum pricing, but it's only part of a healthier lifestyle, thinking about the type of food we consume, how much we consume, and more importantly, Mr. Sharma, about taking iron supplements. Just don't take an iron supplement because you read about it in a magazine. It's going to make you feel better. Go along to your doctor. And my clarion call here is to those watching today, especially in my own constituency of West Dunbartonshire. Go along, talk to the medical profession, tell them about how you're feeling, try and get the test. You may be saving not only yourself a lot of time, you will most probably be saving the NHS a lot of money and making sure that the medical profession in my own constituency know more about it. And again, I'd just like to finish by congratulating the Honourable Member for Rugby, and also I know the members of the Haemochromatosis Association who are here, and all the members of the APPG for the hard work they are doing in this issue.
Diolch, Mr. Sharma. It's a pleasure to serve on your chairmanship, and I'd like to begin by congratulating the Honourable Member for Rugby for securing this important debate, and also to pay tribute to Haemochromatosis UK for their work in supporting both the sufferers of this genetic condition, but also the all-party parliamentary group. And if I may pay particular thanks to Lisa Flood, who first brought this condition to my attention and who has been an invaluable source of information and advice to me in recent months. Now, as we've already heard this afternoon, genetic haemochromatosis is the most common genetic disorder in the UK, and yet remains largely unknown or unfamiliar, meaning that it is often too poorly diagnosed and managed. Approximately 10% of individuals of white European descent, and as my honourable friend from West Dunbartonshire pointed out, particularly those of Celtic descent, talking about some 5 million people, are believed to be genetic carriers of the mutated copy of the haemochromatosis gene, or the HFE gene, as the Honourable Member for Rugby mentioned in his remarks, in the UK. So if that is to be taken, we can then think that perhaps upwards of 100,000, 200,000 people may have two mutated copies of the HFE gene, and are then, of course, at risk of iron toxicity or iron overload, and then the subsequent related diseases and conditions that can emerge from it. And yet, and this is the nub of the debate, I think, in my opinion, for every patient diagnosed with a condition, there are between 8 to 10 who are left undiagnosed, unaware of the risk to their health. And it is some risk, Mr. Sharma. For although genetic haemochromatosis is quite easy to diagnose and to treat, if left untreated, it has serious consequences. Now, two recent studies, which the Honourable Member referred to in her remarks, led by groups from the University of Exeter and Connecticut, have shown that the condition quadruples the risk of liver failure, doubles the risk of arthritis, and individuals with the condition are at higher risk of diabetes and chronic pain. Now, in addition to these serious health complications of iron overload, individuals with genetic haemochromatosis can suffer from fatigue, muscle weakness, and joint pains, which unfortunately often mean that they are mistaken for the signs of ageing or tiredness, but together they can still prove debilitating. And yet, of course, genetic haemochromatosis can be diagnosed and treated effectively when detected. The treatment, as we've already heard this afternoon, entails vivisection. I won't go into that any further. But it is a process that is safe and should be widely available across the UK. But given the pervasiveness of genetic haemochromatosis and the serious impact that iron toxicity has on an individual's health and well-being, the case for ensuring consistent and effective diagnosis of the condition across the UK is clear. This is not a condition for which there is no treatment or diagnosis. The problem that we face is a lack of consistency or standardisation, as the Honourable Member for Rugby put it, in the application of clinical guidelines. A survey of health boards across the country showed that even where protocols are in place, they are often non-mandatory, differ between health boards, and are sometimes discipline-specific. Now, this can be problematic in itself when we consider that haemochromatosis is often treated by a range of specialisms, hepatologists, haematologists and gastroenterologists. Now, introducing standardised guidelines and ensuring their consistent application has the potential, it is believed, to increase diagnosis rates tenfold. Early diagnosis prevents so much unnecessary pain and suffering, and so I do hope the Minister will be able to explore the introduction of a more standardised guidelines or patient pathways for the diagnosis of this condition, for it will vastly improve treatment and management of the condition. And if further persuasion was ever needed, improved diagnosis and earlier treatment of genetic haemochromatosis has the potential to save the NHS considerable resources in the long term. It has already been touched upon by other members, but I'll quickly just conclude, Mr Sharma. Iron overload, we know, can cause a range of cancers, heart failure, diabetes and joint disease. Indeed, researchers have found that for men, 1.6% of all hip replacements and 5.8% of all liver cancers occurred in those with 2 HFE genes. The treatment of these conditions exert incredible pressure on both primary and hospital care. And that is without considering the impact that multiple appointments over years by patients with non-specific chronic conditions has on primary care. I'm conscious that you want me to finish. So to conclude, addressing the current lack of national or standardised guidelines and thus improving the rate of diagnosis on genetic haemochromatosis could reduce the unnecessary suffering of thousands of individuals while also saving the NHS much-needed resources. Or as somebody more eloquent than I put it, it's a no-brainer.
Here, here.
I'm sorry that I was conscious of the time as well,
but
I wanted the Minister to and the opposition spokesperson to respond as well. Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr Sharma. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair. And can I start, as is customary, by honestly congratulating the Honourable Member for Rugby, the chair of the Haemochromatosis APPG, no less, not only for securing today's important and probably historic in terms of the condition debate, but by setting out in such detail the nature of the condition, the prevalence of the condition itself, symptoms and available treatments, such as it is. He also spoke of the great work of Professor Ted Fitzsimmons at University of Glasgow University, and not only that the majority don't know that it can condition, but that thousands of hip replacements may not have even been required, as we've just heard from the Honourable from Ceredigion. I wholeheartedly endorse the 3 asks that he's made of the Minister, and I very much look forward to hearing her respond to those requests. The Honourable Member for Haywood Middleton spoke of the research of nearly 3,000 individuals and the possibility of screening for GH. I'll call it from here on in so I avoid tripping over it. But she also concurred with the Honourable Member for Rugby that given the symptoms, that without screening will remain difficult to diagnose. My honourable friend, the member for Western Bartonshire, spoke of his fair skin, his freckles and of being a ginger. And he also spoke of the Celtic curse. But I'm not sure about Celtic curse, Mr Sharma, but he's certainly known for his Celtic verse, as we heard during his contribution. He also spoke of his constituent, David Macleay, and his GH story, and he spoke of Scotland's story of its relationship with alcohol and what we are doing at the moment to tackle that. And one old friend of mine for Ceredigion, I'll never pronounce that correctly, Mr Sharma, but for every person diagnosed, there are around 8 to 10 who go undiagnosed, and the serious impact that iron toxicity has on health and well-being. The reason I'm also a member of the all-party group, which the member for Rugby chairs, and in all honesty, the reason I am a member is because my dad has genetic haemochromatosis, and I should say I've not been tested myself yet, but I should endeavour to do so at some point in the near future, and I will do so. But he was unaware of his condition. It turned up in a routine blood screening. He felt fine, had no symptoms that he was aware of at that point in time. So he had further checks, including several ultrasounds, an endoscopy and a liver biopsy. But when he was diagnosed, he did some digging around on the internet and found that he absolutely should not touch oysters. Apparently, Google tells you lots of things, but apparently it could prove fatal. But when he told me and I had a look, it also said that you should regulate your alcohol intake. So when I pointed it out to him, he didn't want to know that fact, but was quite happy to accept the oysters. But that's my dad for you. He wasn't put on medication. We've already heard, obviously, the treatment is venesection. But when my dad was diagnosed, the normal ferritin level is around, I'm told, around 50 to 60 or thereabouts. But when he was diagnosed, his level was around 2,400. So it was quite a high ferritin level. But he still didn't have any symptoms at the time. He went on a weekly course of bloodletting for some time, but his levels are now down to normal. But all he does now is every few months is go for venesection and watch his diet, particularly breakfast cereals, which most are fortified with iron. But most concerningly for him is the fact that he can't eat Stornoway black pudding anymore. But as we know, early diagnosis is the key from everyone that's spoken so far. And the SNP welcomes this debate as it offers an opportunity to raise awareness for the first time in House of Commons history, raise awareness for GH and its symptoms. And we welcomed the Living with the Impact of Iron report released last year. Early diagnosis would reduce the demand on primary care service from tens of thousands of chronically affected patients for whom the underlying cause of GH remains unidentified. There is a substantial economic benefit, and I think that's already been outlined by some contributors. On top of individual health benefit for early diagnosis, the cost of a blood test to detect iron overload at an early stage is in the order of a few pounds at most, but the cost to the NHS of a liver transplant arising as a result might be close to £50,000. And one other point I'd like to make is the Scottish Intercollegiate Guidelines Network, or SIGN, collaborates to develop evidence-based guidelines and collaborates with clinicians, social care, health and social care professionals, etc. And we would certainly welcome if SIGN were to publish guidelines in respect for GH. Introducing guidelines would have the potential to increase diagnosis as much as tenfold. But to conclude, Mr Sharma, I'd like to conclude by thanking you again, the Honourable Member, for Rugby and for bringing this important debate and this condition to the attention of the House, and look forward to working with him and the rest of the APPG moving forward and keeping the pressure on the Minister and the Government and, of course, the NHS as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mrs Sharon Hodgson.
Thank you very much, Mr Sharma, and it's an honour to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. I'd like to start by thanking the Honourable Member for Rugby for securing this important debate and for his excellent detailed speech in setting the scene for this debate. I know that he also established the all-party group on genetic haemochromatosis earlier this year, so I congratulate him. I've set up a number of all-party groups myself, and I'm a big believer in them and know how important they are to getting things done cross-party in this House. So I'm pleased he was able to bring this condition to the attention of the House. I'd also like to thank all honourable members who've spoken in this debate, the members who made speeches, in particular Hayward in Middleton, Western Bartonshire, Ceredigion and Paisley in Renfrewshire North, and my other honourable friends who made very helpful interventions. Now, as we've heard, GH, as I'll call it, is a genetic disorder causing the body to absorb excessive amounts of iron from the diet. And iron overload occurs in 1 in every 200 people and is now recognised as the most common genetic disorder. So whilst GH cannot be prevented, as we've heard, its symptoms and health implications can be. And when untreated, GH can cause serious health problems, including fatigue, weight loss, irregular periods, type 2 diabetes, early menopause and depression. And GH was previously thought to be a low-level health risk, but a study by the University of Exeter found that the genetic condition usually quadruples the risk of things such as liver disease and doubles the risk of arthritis and frailty in older age groups. And each one of these, as members have already said, comes at a huge cost to the NHS to treat. It is therefore very important to ensure that symptoms are prevented by diagnosing GH early and advising how to avoid iron overload. I'll give way to my friend.
I think my honourable friend must have extrasensory perception. I was just going to say, would she agree with everybody else who stressed the importance of early diagnosis, but she just did.
Excellent. And if something's worth saying, I always believe it's worth saying more than once. So, with early diagnosis in mind, I've got a number of questions for the Minister, and I'll rattle through them very quickly. So, what assessment has the Minister made about the diagnosis pathways for those patients suspected to have GH, and how early are patients diagnosed after presenting with symptoms, and which diagnosis route has been proven to be more successful and least painful and invasive for patients? And is that diagnosis route available across NHS trusts and CCGs? And when someone is diagnosed, is it routine that their family are also treated, tested and then treated? GH can be aggravated by environmental and lifestyle factors, as we've heard. So can the Minister assure the House that patients with GH are therefore clearly advised on how to care for themselves if they have this disorder? Are patients given direct advice on their diet, alcohol and tobacco consumption? As we've heard, this can make the condition easier to manage if the advice is taken on board, of course, which people often don't want to hear, myself included, what's good for them sometimes. And where necessary, is support available to patients to reduce the alcohol consumption and to quit smoking? As we know, diet and alcohol and tobacco consumption have huge health implications for all of society and cost the NHS millions in treating them. It is therefore crucial that public health services are available to everyone to allow them to live healthier lives, and especially patients with GH who are more susceptible to health problems relating to their heart and liver. So therefore, once again, I never miss an opportunity to call on the Minister, if she can, might be above her pay grade, to reverse the public health budget cuts that have decimated our vital public health services. And I also urge the Minister to ensure that in the Prevention Green Paper, whenever that might be published, I've heard rumours it could be as early as Monday, that patients with any existing conditions are also taken into consideration when we talk about prevention, so that their symptoms can be controlled also. And with that, I look forward to the Minister's response.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Sharma. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I know I am pressed for time, so if I don't respond to comments, will happily write to honourable members. I'd like to begin by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Rugby, for moving this debate, this very important debate on genetic haemochromatosis. I'd also like to thank him and his fellow members of the APPG and all honourable and right honourable members who've spoken in this very important debate today for highlighting this disease, which obviously affects so many of us, and particularly the honourable lady with her scientific knowledge and the very good speech that she made. This government is dedicated to improving the life of all patients who live with rare diseases. It was set out in the long-term plan and the rare diseases strategy. Clearly, early diagnosis and treatment is key to preventing the development of the conditions that can arise from GH. I do hope to be able to answer all the questions that have been raised by my honourable friend and others. One part of diagnosis is genetic testing, and this is a more recent development in GH, and it's used to determine whether a mutation in the HFE gene is present, and which can lead to iron overload. In January of this year, the NHS long-term plan set out the ambition to focus targeted investment in areas of innovation, including genomics. And last year, NHSE launched its genomics medicine service, making the UK the first in the world to integrate whole genome sequencing into routine clinical care. The GMS aims to provide consistent and equitable access to cutting-edge genomic testing to England's population. The first national genomic test directory, which underpins this service, was published in March of this year, and it specifies which genomic tests are commissioned by the NHS in England, the technology by which they're available, and the patients who will be eligible to access them. GH is included in the directory. To ensure that this directory remains at the cutting edge, the test directory will be updated on an annual basis to keep pace with scientific and technological advances, and we are developing a national genomic healthcare strategy which is overseen by Baroness Blackwood, and this is alongside work with Office for Life Sciences. Honourable members have referred to what the UK National Screening Committee and the evidence that they said in 2016, where they said that testing should not be offered, and the Honourable Lady raised it because this does raise massive ethical questions. This was because, of course, not all people with the faulty HFE gene and somebody who's half Irish, I'm now concerned we don't all go on to develop the condition. And at the time, there was no evidence which was found to provided the committee with evidence that a screening programme would be effective. But it's important to take account of new evidence and developments as they emerge. The screening committee is always keen to consider new research and will be looking at new evidence to screen for hereditary GH in 2019-20, and I'd like to assure the House that I will be following this with great interest. Just on the point of the NHS health check, at the moment GH is not in the NHS health check, but Public Health England does routinely publish open call for proposals to include new content in the check, which they can consider in the view of the evidence, cost and clinical effectiveness, feasibility of implementation and health equity. On NICE guidelines, the British Society for Haematology has already published a guideline on the management of GH. This was last updated in 2018. NHSE is the body with responsibility for commissioning new clinical guidelines from NICE, and if it's considered that initial guidance from NICE in this area would add value, any proposals for a NICE guideline can be made to NHS England. On the points that the Shadow Minister has made on the public health budget and the Green Paper, we've often discussed that, and of course it will be subject to best evidence in the spending review. On the point that my Honourable made worked on patient blood meeting ongoing national needs for donated blood, rare blood types and associated blood products, NHS Blood and Transplant have been working in close partnership with Haemochromatosis UK to engage and inform patients with GH that they are able to have their blood removed through blood donation. During National Blood Week in June of this year, articles and social media posts were used to inform patients on the procedure of donating blood at a blood donation centre, and NHSBT are continuing their work to ensure patients are informed of the life-saving gifts that they can give. Patients wanting to donate blood instead of having venesections have to meet the criteria set out by NHS Blood and Transplant for all donors and advised to have iron checkups with their consultant. Patients wanting to donate blood need to call NHS Blood and Transplant National Call Centre and inform them of their condition. This will allow the haemochromatosis patient to donate blood at a donation centre more frequently than the rest of the population. I want to thank all Honourable and Right Honourable members and the members of Haemochromatosis UK who have helped us to raise awareness of this condition, because there is a significant gap in our understanding, and Honourable members have rightly pointed out that this is the first time we're discussing in this House. I fully recognise the need for awareness raising and training of healthcare professionals. I'd like to reassure the House that this government is really committed to ensuring that those affected by rare diseases receive high quality care.
The question is that this House has considered genetic, let me correct my pronunciation, Haemochromatosis, near about. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.